More than 1 in 5 people in the UK, 22% of the population, were in poverty in 2021-22. That's more than 14 million people. Prime Minister Sunak made a statement in Parliament last week that poverty has fallen significantly since 2010. As he often does, he cherry-picked data that does suggest a significant fall. However, the Rowntree Foundation regularly produces credible and reputable data on poverty. Its latest poverty report 2024 paints a very different picture. I've done a separate video showing how Sunak has presented a very misleading picture on the data he was quoting. From the headline data used in the latest Rowntree poverty report, the proportion of people in poverty has not fallen. In fact, it's remained relatively constant for the past 20 years. The definition of poverty is where a household has income less than 60% of the average. The median is used to calculate the average, where the population is split into two and the middle level of household income is taken. In 21-22, the median household income was around £32,000. This means that a household is considered to be in poverty if their income is below around £19,000. Of the 22% that are in poverty, this included 8.1 million working age adults, around 2 in 10 of working age adults, 4.2 million children, nearly 3 in 10, and 2.1 million pensioners, around 1 in 6. We saw earlier the chart showing that UK poverty has remained relatively flat for the past 20 years. It's interesting to break this down a little. We see that children, shown by the blue line, have the highest poverty rate. It's consistently higher than other groups over the past 20 years. The one group where poverty has reduced significantly is pensioners. There are less pensioners in poverty, although of those that are in poverty, many of them are in deep poverty, which is why you need to be careful about quoting individual statistics out of context. Looking at a longer period since the early 1960s, we can see that there was a big jump in poverty during the 1980s, and it has stayed more or less high since. Thatcher embraced the revolution in economics that saw neoliberal ideas take over as the new orthodoxy. Neoliberal economics has now been debunked, as I've discussed in other videos. But the one thing that neoliberal economics has done is to make the rich richer and the poor poorer. One key conclusion of the Rowntree report is that poverty is getting worse for those that are in poverty. In 21-22, 6 million people, or 4 in 10 people in poverty, were in very deep poverty. That's where they have less than 40% of median income. These 6 million people have an income far below the standard poverty line. Let's look at what this actually means. Based on the DWP household income figure for 21-22 of £32,300, the poverty level is around £19,380. The 6 million people in very deep poverty have household income of £12,920. Of course, these poverty levels are the upper limit of the definition of poverty. The average income of all those below the poverty line is 29% below the poverty level, according to the Rowntree Foundation. That means that the average household income for those in poverty is £13,760. For those in very deep poverty, they have average income of £7,946. Remember, this is household income. So if there are 2 adults and 2 children living in a household, this income is providing for 4 people. This is the average of 6 million people in deep poverty, £7,946 a year, £152 per week. Imagine what this 6 million people must feel like when they hear Sunak proudly announcing that poverty has fallen. There's lots of additional evidence highlighting the poverty crisis in the UK. I already did a video on the level of destitution in the UK, but it's worth just remembering that the Rowntree Destitution Report found that around 3.8 million people experienced destitution in 2022. This is defined as a situation where they couldn't afford to meet their most basic physical needs to stay warm, dry, clean and fed. This included around 1 million children. These figures have more than doubled since 2017. Let's just see that in graph form. Destitution up from 1.8 million to 2.8 million for adults and 550,000 to over 1 million for children. I find this just unbelievable. 3.8 million people destitute. There's further evidence of deepening poverty in the increasing number of people using food banks, with more emergency food parcels being delivered by the Trussell Trust network than ever before. There are just under 1,400 Trussell Trust food banks in the UK, in addition to another 1,200 independent food banks. Just for Trussell Trust, the number of food parcels has risen from 1.3 million to 3 million, more than doubled. And for children, Trussell is giving out 1.1 million parcels, up from 490,000, again more than doubled. The evidence continues. The Roundtree Poverty Report also provides some data on how the cost of living crisis is making poverty worse. It found that in October 23, around 2.8 million were in arrears with their household bills or behind on scheduling loan repayments. 4.2 million households were going without essentials, and 3.4 million households reported not having enough money for food. And finally, the Citizens Advice Bureau has recently provided some new evidence on poverty and energy bills. Their research shows that 5.3 million people currently live in households in debt to their supplier. 800,000 people went more than 24 hours without gas or electricity last year because they couldn't afford to top up. And more than 2 million people across Great Britain will disconnect from their gas and electricity this winter because they can't afford to top up their prepayment meter. I could go on, but I think you get the picture. This is nothing short of a crisis, and it's on our doorstep. I really wonder how politicians can sleep at night knowing that this is the case. In fact, how can any of us sleep while we know that a very significant minority in the UK is suffering, so poor that they can't even cover the basics? Some might say that we can't afford to provide any more help to those suffering from poverty. I would say that we can't afford not to. I hope you found this information useful. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.